Hi, friends, and welcome to this series of Shop Talk interviews that dives deep into the creative process of making comics, writing books, and adapting classic stories. My name is Lex Fajardo. I'm a cartoonist and the creator of the graphic novel series Kid Beowulf, an action-adventure series that reimagines Beowulf and Grendel as twin brothers and follows their adventures across Europe and Asia, meeting fellow epic heroes therein. The newest book in the series, Kid Beowulf Odyssey, is kickstarting this month at kidbcomickickstarter.com and is sponsoring this series of interviews. My guest today is Gareth Hinds, an author and illustrator behind a slew of graphic novel adaptations, including Beowulf, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, Edgar Allan Poe, the Odyssey, the Iliad, and most recently, the AENEID. Gareth's books are New York Times bestsellers and instant hits with English teachers and their students across the country. I've known Gareth for many years, and I'm excited to chat with him today. He was one of the first cartoonists I met who managed to adapt Beowulf into graphic novel form, which was a real inspiration for me. On top of that, he was the first author to give me a blurb for my 2005 edition of Kid Beowulf, and I really appreciate his time today talking shop about adapting classics and making comics. Gareth's a real class act, and I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. So enjoy. Gareth, thank you so much for joining me for this first shop talk that I'm doing, where I'm just chatting with cartoonists and creators and folks who have tackled adaptations of the Odyssey. This of course is the summer of the Odyssey. Even though you and I have lived with it throughout our lives, the big budget Christopher Nolan epic is coming out. I don't know. Have you been
Yeah.
keeping tabs on that at all by any
Yeah, a
chance?
little bit. Yeah. I just saw an interview with him on Stephen Colbert.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wonder, what is your first take on that trailer that you saw?
I mean, it's interesting. Like, it's hard to tell from that trailer. He's keeping a lot of stuff, kind of held back a little bit. But I mean, I think he's got very atmospheric, very dramatic. Like, he's hitting the dramatic beats. It doesn't look like he's cut out any major things, right? Um, at the same time, he's clearly not going for a 100% historically accurate kind of rendition. He's going for a popularly acceptable, digestible version of it, which I think is, probably the right call. And my hope is that it'll just raise a lot of interest and excitement about the Odyssey, but then people will still be like, okay, clearly, like, we want to find the real Odyssey. Maybe they'll read the original, or maybe they'll go to my book as a stepping stone in between. Who knows?
Absolutely. Yeah. Which I've been revisiting your editions, and this is the paperback edition that I have, but just,
Yeah.
am I right, just earlier this week a new edition has come out.
Yeah.
Can you
Yeah,
tell
this
us?
is
Oh,
the
wow.
new deluxe hardcover with shiny foil, and it's got the sprayed edges on the sides, which is very exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had Candlewick had been talking about doing like a reissue or a special edition at some point, and then I think they were just kind of slow walking it until they realized that there was a movie. Not that they were really sitting on it; they just weren't in a hurry. And then they were like, "Oh, there's a movie coming out. We should do this now." So, yeah, it's good. It's good timing, and that officially released this past Tuesday. Doing a
Wow.
bunch of events for that around my area in DC, and a couple out in LA as well.
For those of us who have the original version, aside from it being the hardback, is there anything you revisited or touched up, or
Not really. I mean, I kind of wanted to do that, and also didn't have time to do that because I was this was all happening right when I was totally in the weeds on the Aeneid, which is my next book coming out in the spring. So that kind of had to take priority. So I wasn't able to generate any new material for the deluxe edition, unfortunately. But yeah, it's just a real pretty edition.
No, it looks really nice. I love anytime you can add spot gloss, and then the sprayed edges. Those are very nice touches. Congratulations on that
Thank you.
re-release. And then, I want to give you a digital high five for the congratulations on, in your newsletter, you shared this image of you holding this massive stack
Yeah.
of finished pages. So you have completed the Aeneid, is that correct?
Yeah, I completed the Aeneid. I mean, I'm doing some final edits still. I delivered, a full version to the publisher, and I'm waiting to get their comments back. And while I wait, I make some more edits on my end as well. But basically, that's all colored. It's essentially done. Will be truly done in June.
I've been revisiting your Iliad, and really just been impressed by the sheer scope of it. I mean, both the Iliad and the Odyssey are massive. The
Yeah.
Aeneid is sort of like, I know every time I read it, it seems like Virgil has decided to take them both and combine them. And so for someone like you who is adapting it, um, was that your take too? Is sort of like, oh, there's this fanciful element um, in Virgil, but there's also this, lots of big battles. And then how did you even approach the this third in the trifecta, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, I think natively in the text, and what I tried to emphasize is that there's all these like interesting callbacks to Homer, right? It's kind of like almost, fanfic for Homer at the same time that he's adding a bunch of cool stuff that isn't in Homer, and also trying to create this Roman creation myth, essentially. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting dimensions to it. I found it was very complex. It was I mean, I was able to get it down to about the same length as the Odyssey and the Iliad, but I think it's actually a little bit denser informationally. There's some longer sections of narration in it and things like that. But yeah, one of the things that Virgil does, is he leaves a little bit more of the reader's imagination than Homer does. Homer has these incredibly vivid, detailed descriptions. And there's some of that in Virgil, but there's also a lot of things where he just says, well, and then there was this thing. And then you're like, well, what was that? And then you look up, oh, hey, that's something really cool. Like I can kind of expand on that in the illustrations, or just things that he doesn't describe as minutely. And that gives me a lot of room for, artistic exploration and interpretation. And like the Iliad, he uses a lot of great metaphors, which I also enjoy sort of illustrating and bringing to life on the page.
Yeah. Were there things in the first two books that you revisited or refined in this version? I'm thinking of like he does visit Aeneas does visit the underworld, and
Yeah.
Odysseus does that as well. Was your interpretation similar to what you showed in the Odyssey?
Yeah, so I did. I decided to keep the same artistic style. So basically, anytime we're in the underworld, it's drawn on gray paper instead of most of the pages are pencil and watercolor, but the underworld scenes are gray paper drawn with black and white pencil. So it's a kind of an additive, subtractive thing going on. And then the art is just grayscale, and then digitally, I put some little bit of very subtle color tinting on it. So it's all sort of suggests this kind of twilight world that's different from the real world. But then Virgil's underworld is so different from Homer's. He's got this whole other cosmology, and he just, Homer's just sort of essentially describing like a big undefined place where all these dudes just hang out together. And Virgil is kind of the first real source where we get all this idea of like different areas of the underworld, and like people being sent different places depending on if they have sins that they haven't resolved or whatever. And there's a whole crazy spread that I loved illustrating where he's gone to see his father, and his father sort of lays this all out for him and tells him, these souls are waiting for rebirth, and here's what has to happen before they get reborn. And he has this whole cosmology that, kind of never seen before or since. It's a little bit unique to that, moment where he's drawing on different sources from the Greeks and the Romans.
How did you attack the actual layout?
Yeah, so I mean, the underworld section in the Aeneid is I think it's about 14, maybe 16 pages, and there's the spread where Anchises, Aeneas's father, is describing that cosmology. That's its own page. So there's a spread that's basically that, where he's big and he's got all this kind of ghostly stuff floating around him, showing you different animals and humans and things, what happens to them. And then on the right-hand side is where he talks about how Aeneas's descendants are going to found Rome. So we sort of blend from that into this idea of, you know, what these people who are waiting to be born, some of them are Aeneas's descendants, and they're going to, you know, become eventually the, you know, the progenitors of Rome.
Right, right. Oh wow, that I look forward to seeing that. And that's is that 2027 that we're going to
Yeah,
see the
spring, like March 27. Yep.
Okay, okay. So I guess my my first question is, like, you had that massive stack of paper. Have you recovered from this epic?
You know, I mean, yes and no. I took a vacation, so I had a vacation plan for right after I delivered the color art, and that helped enormously. I mentioned I do still have a bunch of edits to do, so once I'm really done in June, I will take another vacation, and then, you know, and then we'll see. The last couple of books I did, I had enough burnout that I didn't jump into another book for like 6 months after, or more. So. We'll see how I'm feeling after this one. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. When you're in that editing phase, I mean, do you have enough distance now when you've taken this break, and now you're gonna get into the fine tuning? Is it all on your shoulders? Are you getting notes from Candlewick at this point to
Yeah.
find
So
things?
the distance definitely helps, and I am definitely going back through it and, you know, seeing different things, and continuing to make notes about stuff that I want to change. And then I also have Candlewick. You know, I get sort of collated notes from my editor, my designer, and my art director. Um, and then from copy editing, which is, you know, where in theory they're just going over the text very carefully, but they also go over the art very carefully, and I actually get probably more stuff from copy editing that I actually have to fix than I get from, you know, from the general editorial review. But then also, you know, I have early readers that I'm showing it to, and, you know, one of them is my wife. She's very sharp-eyed. She's often the one who's telling me when people's faces look weird, because some people aren't as keyed into that, but she really notices that. And then I also have a number of scholarly readers, so I'm sending them new versions, being like, hey, I changed the text here, can you take a look at that? And that's something that's relatively new. I had, you know, when I did the Odyssey, I did not have any scholarly readers review it. And for the Iliad, I had one, and that was extremely helpful. But then for the Aeneid, you know, he also, his name is Stephen Guerrero. He also worked with me on the Aeneid, but he also connected me to a couple of specifically Latin scholars.
Oh,
So I've got some, you know, some people with their eyes on it who really are experts in Virgil.
oh, that's great. Wow.
Yeah.
When you have that kind of resource, have you, by that point, have you already done, or I imagine you've already done, the visualization of the world? And I'd imagine the Aeneid, a lot of that
Mhm.
groundwork has been laid in the first two books,
Yeah.
because the Aeneid just takes place right on the heels of the Iliad.
Yeah.
But were there new things you're bringing to the table in terms of, I don't know, architecture or the way a
Yeah,
ship
I
might?
mean, there's new characters, and you know, we go to Italy, which, you know, Italy does not show up in, you know, in Homer, at least in the Homeric epics that we still have. And so yeah, there's definitely new material to look at, and there's also, uh, you know, there, a lot of the characters show up again, and I, you know, try to keep the designs consistent. But then sometimes, you know, there's somebody who shows up later. I'm trying to think of a good example, but you know, like some of the gods, you know, there's the same gods, but now they have Roman names. But then there's like a few new gods, you know, like Turnus's sister Juturna is a demigod, and, you know, there's the god of the Tiber River. You know, so there's all
Yeah,
these kind of new characters that join the pantheon. And, you know, all of that is useful to have their opinion on, although mostly they don't. Mostly they've just been very complimentary visually. A lot of the stuff that they're commenting on is like how I've adapted the text,
yeah,
because that's what their, you know, their real expertise is. And um, you know, and I did something in the Aeneid that gave me, you know, additional challenges that was very helpful to have their opinion on, which is that I did all the narration in iambic pentameter, which
oh wow,
was a little bit insane.
Yeah.
It's just sort of happened organically. I was like, oh, here's a major speech. I want to put this in verse, you know? And so I did that. And then I was like, well, here's another major speech. I'm gonna do that. And then I was like, well, what's the logic behind what's in verse and what's not? And then I was like, well, maybe what makes sense is if I just have all the narration be in verse, you know? And then I was like, but
Okay.
that's crazy. But I think I'm gonna do it.
Right.
So yeah, all the narration plus a couple of the major like pieces of dialogue, like when Zeus lays out the whole future of Aeneas in Rome, or when Dido is kind of giving her funerary farewell suicide speech. Those are all in iambic pentameter. So.
Oh wow. Okay.
And it's a
Uh,
little bit loose, like you know, my wife was like, I don't understand the rules of this iambic pentameter. You're breaking them all the time, you know. And I was like, well, that's what a lot of the poets do, right?
right.
So I'm
Yeah.
not
Yeah. Yeah.
like super rigid with my iambic pentameter, but I do try and keep that, you know, 5 feet to a line, and maintain that rhythm through the narration.
Right. Right. Well, and I would also imagine like by by the time you've reached a third adaptation of this, like there's like you are these are Gareth Hinds versions of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they're very very uh you know, you could read them alongside Fagles and Fitzgerald, but at the same time, as a as the author, you have sort of some license, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I hear from these scholars again and again is like it's great that I'm being so respectful and staying so close to the source material, but also, you know, it's coming out of this tradition of oral retelling where it's just kind of expected that every storyteller is going to put their own spin on it. And so, you know, they're not like, oh my God, how, you know, you changed this thing. Like, what were you thinking? It's more like, yeah, you changed that thing. Like that's your, you know, kind of right as a storyteller in that tradition. Um, and you know, but yes, it also helps that, you know, that I'm staying very close to the original plot and everything, and I'm not, you know, completely
Yeah.
trying to be
Well, there
like,
was
Virgil didn't know what he was doing. Let me completely change this, you know.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. This is how you do it. Well, it's funny because when I, you know, was revisiting the Odyssey, there were a couple of moments, and even also in the Iliad, there's a moment where we see Hephaestus making the armor,
Yeah,
and it's almost as if you have a couple of automatons behind, they all sort of look like robots. And then
yeah,
there's a moment, I think it's when is Odysseus visiting
yeah,
the Phaeacians, and you have almost the robot dogs.
yeah.
And can you remind me, um, how are they described in the? I don't recall that sort of. How did
That's
you arrive at
basically how they're described in the text. I mean, it's Hephaestus is the original roboticist. I mean, you know, yeah, when Odysseus shows up at the Hall of Phaeacians, they, you know, it says that there are these dogs outside guarding the entrance, and they're these metal dogs made by Hephaestus.
that? Okay.
Um, and then in his workshop, he has these women who are made out of metal that he has constructed to help him, you know, to be
Wow.
his shop assistants, right?
Yeah.
Um, and of course, I mean, of course, I visualize those in my own way, but like basically within the description in the text. Interestingly, in the Aeneid, Virgil, you know, describes Hephaestus's workshop. Maybe it's his. I like to think it's his other workshop because he describes something totally different, which is inside the active volcano of Mount Etna, and he has these three cyclops working as his assistants and helping him build the armor of Aeneas.
Okay.
So it's, you know, there's things that are different. Also, same thing with Aeolus, the you know, master of the winds. You know, Homer's very specific that he's on this floating island made out of bronze and all this stuff. But in the Aeneid, he just lives in a again, like essentially in a volcano, like on this like hollow island, and that's not floating, that's not made out of metal. So again, it's like, yeah, maybe he has multiple homes, or we're
Right.
just, you know, again, poetic license, right? So
Yeah. 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 That's really cool. I'm gonna have to revisit um, the that text because it was
yeah,
just so neat to see it visually because I had not, you know, of all the adaptations I've read, I've never seen it depicted that way. So super
yeah,
cool.
yeah.
And so I guess my, you know, I wonder as you're arriving at the visual language for these books, um, do you revisit other adaptations from people, whether it's storybooks or film or TV, or like how do you balance that,
Yeah.
that mode of like being inspired versus, you know, seeing how other people have done it, so to speak,
Yeah, I mean, mostly I don't read other adaptations of these classics. The exception, I guess, would be like with Shakespeare. I'm always looking at other people's interpretations of Shakespeare because I feel like there's so many creative, kind of wild reimaginings of Shakespeare, and that just helps spark my own imagination. And I could consider doing something like that because of that long tradition with Shakespeare. But for the Odyssey and the Iliad, I really, tried to keep my vision of it, kind of. I'm not going to say pure because, like, I had read, I think it was the first version of the Odyssey that I read was the Robert Fitzgerald edition, and it had illustrations in it and of course I had read Dolaire's, and I had read what are their names, the famous couple, the Provincens.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And so I had a bunch of images in my head already associated with Greek mythology and with the Odyssey, but yeah, I did not seek out any other adaptations. The only time was when I was drawing the scene with the axes at the end of the Odyssey. And I became aware that different translators translate this scene differently, and it's kind of hard to visualize how he sets up these axes that he's going to shoot the arrow through. And so I went looking, and it was like, oh yeah, there's this like kind of bad Armand Assante Odyssey movie, and there's so at that point I watched that kind of near the end of my process, and there was a couple, I looked up a couple of other illustrations of that scene just to see how different people had visualized it before I kind of went with what I had already been thinking anyway. I was just like, is there a better, more obvious way to do this? But yeah, that's a tricky scene, of course, because it's like, what is meant by shooting through 12 axe heads, and how does he do that?
Yeah, no, it is strange. And actually, so the book that I'm working on now is obviously the Odyssey, and I haven't arrived at. I've sort of scripted a scene where a young Odysseus is in my version, he's sort of being trained by Eumaeus in archery, and they're like maybe 3 or 4 axe heads that he's trying to like. So it's sort of something he sort of builds up to. But again, like, how do you actually visualize that on the page? I haven't quite cracked that code. But it is always neat to see how other people do it. And I don't know if, did you see The Return, which was the Ralph?
I actually didn't, and I'm embarrassed to say that. I should have seen it as soon as it came out. I was too busy, and then it just went by. And I'm kind of sad that it just went by. Like, I felt like it didn't get as much attention as maybe it deserved, but again, I haven't seen it. So
yeah, no, I would agree with that. I did see it in the theater, and then I think it's now available to, but it's really well done, and it's a much more earthbound take on the Odyssey. There are no gods, and it's he's suffering from PTSD as he would, but it's they make some really interesting choices. But the trial of the bow is really it's just emotional how they film it, and so I recommend it. Different from the Armand Assante version for sure. Yeah. But one of the things I wanted to ask you regarding the visual style of these 3 books, and I'm going to cite your newsletter again, which I think I'll probably throw a link up there so folks can join and follow you along. You have that image of Hera, or Juno, I guess in this case, right?
Juno,
She's sort of hounding Aeneas. And I guess 2 questions is, how did you handle that transition of the naming conventions, if that was something you actually thought about, or just like, this is how they are? And then I guess my other question is she looks very similar as you've depicted her in the Iliad, but almost even more refined. Was that just a natural occurrence of just more drawing, or?
I'll answer that second part first. I think the drawings in the Aeneid are a little bit more refined, and that's mostly just the result of I've been drawing for another however many years since I did the Iliad, and more so since I did the Odyssey. And also I'm using different tools. I'm always experimenting with different tools, and for the AENEID, I ended up using Clip Studio to do the pencil art.
Okay.
And I really like the pencil tools in Clip Studio, and also it's a vector pencil, so I can go back and I can tweak things very easily after I draw them, which is really cool. But it just has a nice, it's not quite as heavy as the pencil tool that I used for the Iliad in Procreate, and it allows me to be a little tighter without feeling like I'm getting tight, compared to, you know, the real pencil that I used in the Odyssey.
Oh, okay. So the Odyssey was traditional pencils. The Iliad
Yeah, the Odyssey
was
was, yeah, the only thing I did digitally in the Odyssey was the rough layouts, and then everything was traditional in the final art. Whereas the Iliad, I drew digitally and then printed out on watercolor paper, watercolored it. And that's the same thing for the Aeneid, but using a different digital tool. And in terms of the characters' names, so there's a cast page at the beginning of the Iliad and also at the beginning of the Aeneid, where the, you know, the sort of recurring characters that I think the reader is most likely to want to flip back and remind themselves who they are listed, and the gods are listed with, you know, here's their Roman name that they're in this book, but then, you know, in parentheses, the Greek name that you might know from previous books.
I'm really fascinated to hear about this, your progression of tools.
Sure.
And then and I guess also did you consciously arrive at this illustrative style for which you, I guess you laid it down in the Odyssey and then sort of refined it with these other two books. But
Yeah.
you know, when I read it, it sort of has this middle space of it reminds me of like a traditional illustrated book, but it's obviously in graphic novel form.
Yeah.
And was that a conscious decision to sort of, because it also, I think from a reader's point of view, like when you're, you know, the comics is super accessible, but at the same time, it's a classic piece. So
Yeah.
were these things you consciously were thinking of when you were putting this together?
Yeah, I mean, from the beginning when I started adapting classics, I didn't want it to look like a modern comic book entirely, right? I wanted the art to really be a nod immediately to, you know, this is an old story. And so like in Beowulf, the first classic that I adapted was Beowulf, and the first section of Beowulf is basically intended to look like it's an illuminated manuscript. Like it's got a parchment background and it's got all these kind of elaborate like borders and things. And there's kind of like almost a bleed effect around the ink art, as though it, you know, it's sort of, the ink has been sitting on the page for hundreds of years, right? That kind of stuff. So, and then for everything going forward, I always have like some kind of visual reference or visual experiment that I want to try to capture, you know, the feeling of the story, because I think that's one of the opportunities for a comics adaptation to, you know, to do, and for comics in general to do, is to really capture a mood very quickly with the art and very powerfully. And so when I got to the Odyssey, I was trying a bunch of different things, and I ended up really liking this sort of loose pencil and watercolor, because it almost felt like a sketchbook, almost as though I had gone back to ancient Greece and, like, you know, drawn this whole story on location and brought it back to you, kind of thing, was what I was thinking.
Yeah.
And then, you know, then you get into the Iliad and it's like, oh my God, this is, now I have to draw like thousands of guys in armor, you know, and it was like, okay, well, I think the style still works, but also I think I want to do it digitally so that I can build the images up in layers and that's easier to edit and things like that. So that's sort of how that evolution happened.
Okay. And then was it a quick, easy transition to Clip Studio? I've not used it before, but I've heard it.
Yeah, so I had actually used Clip Studio previously for Romeo and Juliet, where the art was inked digitally, and I had used Clip Studio for that, for the same reason of it being very editable after, you know, the drawings being very easy to edit. And then when I realized that basically all the tools in Clip Studio can be used in vector mode, you know, I thought, oh, well, you know, I should try that for my pencil work. And so I did some experiments early on. I did a couple of pages where I would, you know, draw one panel in Procreate and another panel in Fresco and another panel in Clip Studio and another panel in Photoshop. and just kind of look at them all together and be like, okay, yeah, I think the Clip Studio pencil really works. I think it's very, it has this very sensitive but precise kind of feeling to it, without feeling too tight or too heavy. So that's what I went with. And there's actually, there's a couple early pages. The other experiment that I tried was no line work at all, because I thought, in my personal work, I love to just go out with some paints and like paint landscapes, and I don't do any drawing first when I do that usually.
Okay.
And it's a little challenging, but it's also very kind of freeing. And I thought, well, is there any chance I could do the book that way? And I did a couple of panels that way that I liked. And so then I actually started in on some of the real pages that way, and then quickly realized, wait a minute, when I get to the battle scenes, it really is a problem. It really gets too complicated too quickly to do that. And so there were a couple pages I had to go back and redraw, either because I had drawn them with like Procreate, or because I had not drawn any line work at all.
Okay. I'm just like, yeah, at some point I thought, what is the line work colored?
Yeah, and when the gods are drawn in color,
yeah.
So I did the line work in color, and then sometimes I had to strengthen it a little bit with actual color pencils or digitally afterwards, just because the printer didn't print it out quite as vividly as the color I wanted in the finish. But for the most part, it worked to just do those drawings in color in Clip Studio.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, doing them in color, or the line work in color, is a great way to just sort of differentiate that.
Yeah, I came up with that idea right very early on in the Odyssey. Of course, it starts right off the bat. Athena disguises herself to go talk to Telemachus, and so I had to immediately decide, how was I going to make it clear that this is still Athena. And the thing I came up with was that the gods would always be, each one would have their own color, and they appear all in that color when they're sort of themselves. But then when they're in disguise, they're colored normally, except that their outline is still that color. Can
Yeah,
into it.
yeah. No, it's really, and it's one of those things you could kind of only do in comics.
Yeah.
Film too, I suppose there is that.
I mean, you could do something similar in film, but you wouldn't literally have line work unless it was animation, right? So
yeah. And I think also, speaking of film, they always shy away from the gods, which I don't know if you have any strong opinions about that, one way or the other.
Well,
why that is.
I don't know either. I think maybe it's just because they're worried that a modern audience either sort of won't be willing to suspend disbelief that the gods are there, or that some kind of like Christian audience is going to come after them for representing a pagan pantheon. I don't know, but I noticed that Nolan has been super cagey about it. On that Colbert interview, he's like, oh, I'm not saying, but. But he's like, but we didn't see Zendaya yet. So like, my understanding is she's Athena probably. So I think he is going to show the gods maybe, but
yeah, no, I'm very curious about that, because I do recall Troy, which was the film with Brad Pitt, and with a great Sean Bean as Odysseus, I will say. I think I did like his depiction of Odysseus, but the gods were not seen at all. And that clearly is I think I've been listening to a lot of and reading some adaptations of the Iliad and whatnot, and they all are, it must be just a modern thing where we just, to your point, that it's
Age of Bronze, same thing, right?
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, I think it makes sense, right? In that right, the gods are a way of interpreting real events, and presumably, if we literally were standing there when those events happened, we would not see the gods, right? That is, how something that was overlaid as an explanation. So I can understand that impulse, but in the same way that, like I always like to talk about in Macbeth, whenever I see a stage adaptation of Macbeth, I do not want to see any special effects for the ghosts or the apparitions or anything. I just want the actor to convince me that he sees those things. But when I went to do it as a graphic novel, it was like, no, we got to see all of that. So same thing I felt like in the graphic novel, A, I had to be faithful to the text, and that was the real reason, but also B, I just think we want to see everything that's described, even if it's just a metaphor, I still want to see it.
Yeah. And then, for Macbeth, how did you depict that? Was it sort of like just a manifestation of his psychosis, or was it more literal, or how did you?
Yeah, it's more literal. So like when he's seeing the dagger, we're actually seeing, the glowing dagger. And again, I don't want to see that on the stage. I don't want to see that on film, but in the graphic novel, that's what I want to see. But then I would also take it a little more metaphorically, like when he's walking sort of away from his bedroom after that scene, his shadow is the shape of a dagger. And then, there's like when he talks about he's stepped in so far in blood, he's just using a metaphor, but I have like the floor covered in blood and stuff like that. And of course, I really went to town on Banquo's Ghost. Like Banquo's Ghost is like sort of like keeps ramping up throughout the scene. Starts out kind of just like, oh, it's Banquo, but he's a little bloody, and then by the end of the scene, he's like this giant guy, and you can see all his organs and stuff.
Oh my gosh!
Wow. Kind of almost like an Akira kind of thing.
This Shop Talk episode is brought to you by the books we make. Order Kid Beowulf Odyssey at kidbcomickickstarter.com. Order the Odyssey Deluxe Edition at bookshop.org. Now, back to the interview. You had mentioned, I think, earlier the amount of energy it takes to do these books. And as I've been rereading the Iliad, I was struck by like, oh yeah, I've done my fair share of battle scenes in my books, but they aren't like 200 pages of battle scenes. So I was really curious, like how did you approach like choreography?
Yeah.
And then just like the sheer physical might of drawing. Because I don't know if, folks who may not know, like it is physically hard to draw a comic book. And when you are, or just illustrating in general, but, panel after panel, page after page, like how did you even tackle that?
So, I mean, I will say one thing that's very helpful is that Homer talks a lot about billowing clouds of dust.
Yeah.
So I heavily employed that device to kind of hide armies in the background, and you just sort of see their spears sticking up out of the dust cloud or whatever, right? But there's still tons of scenes where we see a lot of dudes, and like they're all, I was trying to kind of like walk this fine line where the armies are sort of color coded, and you can kind of tell who's in which army. But at the same time, it's not realistic in most cases that they would all have the same armor and weapons. So there's kind of like these variations where if you see 20 Trojans, they're all going to have slightly different shades of blue, green, and purple in their shields and their helmet crests and all this stuff. So that's a lot of work to draw and to color, right? The coloring is still very complicated even after it's all drawn. And so yeah, like using the dust cloud, zooming in, zooming out, right? So if you're real tight on a character, then you don't really expect to see all the details in the background. Sometimes doing real high angles so that you do see a lot, but it's all just little marks and tiny circles and lines, and not the actual recognizable details. All those kind of tools I would employ. Low angles where you just see the front row of guys, that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's still an enormous amount of work. And what I found was helpful because the Odyssey was also a lot of work, but not to the same extent. And in the Odyssey, the part I knew was going to be the hardest was just the suitors and the battle at the end with the suitors. And so for that battle, I actually I hired a model and I had a costume made for him. And so I drew a lot of that stuff from life or got photo reference for those poses, and that made that all a lot easier. But most of those characters are not in armor. So the armor makes it much harder to do that because everybody's armor is a little different, and the armor is harder to make for a model to wear or something. So what helped was because I was drawing it digitally, and because the tools are good enough now that I could draw it. I could work on my iPad, which I could set on my drawing table, or I could sit on the couch, or I could go sit in the cafe, or I could also work at home on my, on my big, I've got a big Cintiq here. I guess I can't quite turn the camera enough to see it, but it's right next to my computer. I got a big Cintiq. So if I want to work on a bigger surface that's a little more ergonomic, I can do that. So sort of changing up the position so that you're not just always in the same repetitive motions and the same angles and stuff is very helpful physically. I also think it's super helpful to have some kind of a physical, release where you get out of the house and, just take a walk around the block, which I try and do every day, but also, I practice martial arts, I do Aikido, do that like 3 times a week. So that's very helpful to get out and really move my body around, and just sort of forces me to have a little structure in my day and, not work all night and all that kind of stuff. So,
no, I think I recall that you're a martial artist, which makes me wonder, like, again, because there's such physicality in
Yeah.
those page layouts, like you yourself being physical, that must be very helpful in the choreography, because you know how a body moves and what it can and can't do. And
Yeah, and I've always been fascinated by that aspect of it. I mean, I got into martial arts, from watching like Bruce Lee movies when I was like 8 years old, and so like right away I was like playing with my Star Wars action figures and trying to choreograph these whole elaborate melee fights. Um, and I've done a few different martial arts, so because Aikido is mostly not applicable to these books that I'm doing. It does show up a little bit in Beowulf, where he's trying to wrestle Grendel down and like put all these joint locks and stuff on him so that he can like break his arm off. Right. So it was applicable there, but most of my other books, it's much more, it's spears and it's guns and it's swords and it's, all this kind of stuff that we don't really do in Aikido. But having done some Kung Fu and some other martial arts, I'm able to, to kind of bring that lens to it and to really get into and kind of geek out on designing those scenes. Unfortunately, there's so many fights in, say, the Iliad that I couldn't really, like, for example, I didn't have a real elaborate battle between Achilles and Hector, because at that point in the story, we've already watched, 30, 40, 50 fights happen, in the story. Yeah. So instead, I sort of did this kind of slow-mo thing and just focused it on this one moment where they meet and Achilles immediately kills him. Versus in the Aeneid, there's a big ending fight scene between Aeneas and the main guy on the other side, who is Turnus.
Yeah.
And they have a big long fight scene at the end of that, which is a lot of fun to do.
Look forward to seeing that. Maybe Aeneas will have some kung fu action in there that you brought in.
There was also Graceling had a little bit of Aikido in it because
did it? Okay.
Graceling, the main character in Graceling is sort of has almost like a superpower for close combat, and she and her main sort of initially antagonist, who becomes the romantic interest, also is sort of graced in that way. So there's all these great fights between her and other people and between her and him, where they're doing all kinds of crazy kung fu type stuff.
So as you like, you're in this next mode of the book production, and you've done this. Will the Aeneid be your 12th book, maybe? Or
I was trying to figure it out that other day. I think I figured out it's maybe my 13th book, but it also depends on how you count like multiple editions and books that are out of print and stuff like that. But I think it might be 13. Yeah.
Wow. Is there I would imagine like every part of the process you've got it pretty well mapped out, or is it different for every project? Like I do recall a talk you gave where you had this really intricate timeline of like your delivery schedule, and is that something that you adhere to for each and every book?
Yeah, at this point I have a process that's pretty well worked out, but I'm still tinkering with it for every book. So different drawing tool, different way of transitioning to the finished art, basically, right? Like, so once you have the whole book in rough sketches, how you get from there to the finished art, there's lots of different ways to do it, and I'm always tinkering with that. But yeah, I always build out a schedule, and that's super important because life happens. You always fall behind schedule, and it's really important to know when you're actually in trouble, when you need to make changes, versus when you're fine. And especially what I've found is for the big projects like the Iliad and the Aeneid, and to a certain extent Graceling, if a project goes longer than 2 years, then life is going to probably intervene in some more significant way.
Yeah.
And so, both of those are projects where I've had to adjust the schedule, but knowing that and knowing when that has to happen, relies on having built out a schedule that's not super intricate. It's just every month I know how many pages of layouts, of drawings, of coloring I have to do. And that allows me to predict the date that I'm going to deliver the book to my publisher. And then as I'm going along, I'm just checking against that and seeing, hey, that milestone I was supposed to hit on, April 1st, I didn't hit it until April 10th. So I'm 10 days behind. Okay. Now I know I have to turn it up a little bit. And then if the next month I'm 15 days behind, and the next month I'm a whole month behind, then I know I'm on a trend that's not, going to work out, and I need to either adjust the schedule or adjust my process or, adjust something, right?
Right.
Something major. Whereas, if I'm just holding at 10 pages behind, that's like, okay, we're fine. Towards the end, I'm going to have to accelerate. I know that, but like, most of the time I'm trying to keep a good work-life balance, and I'm trying to, work like a 9 to 5 in the studio, be able to go run errands in the afternoon if I have to, go to appointments or whatever. But like, basically a 40-hour week. And then at the end, when things go off the rails, hopefully I just have like a month where I'm really crunching and working 12-hour days. But on these giant projects, sometimes it's a lot more than a month. So that's when
Right.
it sucks. And that's why I get burned out.
Sure. Yeah. No, but I think it's, I think the audience who would be listening to this are probably other creators. And so I think it's really important just to hear that schedule that you've built, and that it is,
Yeah.
this is your 9 to 5, so to
Yeah.
speak. And you treat it as such. And
Yeah.
and that's always something I've in the back of my brain, because I have the day job. So whenever I'm doing my own stuff, I just always feel I'm doing it piecemeal. Like, it's sort of whenever
Yeah.
I can scrounge out the hour to do it, which always just sort of protracts
Yeah.
a project and makes it that much longer. So,
Yeah.
but whatever the mode you might have to, your life might be, um, this diligence that you've got is the key for any creator.
Yeah, and I will say also, like, there was a moment maybe a year ago when people were posting horror stories on social media about, they got these tiny advances and they work on these books for years, and they hurt, they got RSI, and they hurt themselves, right, in various ways. And it is a problem throughout the industry that like advances are not proportional to the amount of work that goes into a graphic novel generally. And so it's important to have an idea of your schedule and your finances and what your body can put up with and for how long. Because yeah, if you take a $20,000 advance to do a book that's going to take 2 years or something, right, then you better have worked out that you're going to be able to sustain that for 2 years. Because if you think, if you find yourself trapped in that and you're
Right.
not able to do it, that's rough. And I certainly took small advances on my first couple of books, including the Odyssey. The Odyssey had a very small advance for a book that took almost 2 years. And the only reason that worked out is because I had worked out my finances, and I knew that I sort of had that runway to have time to do that book. And then, and then it sold well. So it paid off.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't be able, if it hadn't paid off, if the advance was all I got, I wouldn't have been able to turn around and do another book with that same advance, with that same length. That wouldn't have been sustainable.
Right. Yeah. And you're all well, and thankfully you're also able to parlay, the fact that you are, one of your big niches is adaptations, which educators and teachers and are keen on. But I assume you also are doing school visits on a regular basis.
Yes. So most authors do school visits to supplement their income, and I do some of that. I mean, it's at this point, especially coming off the last couple of years where I was working really hard, I don't take as many of them, so it's not as big a part of my life as it is for some people. But it's part of what allows you to work a long time for a small advance, is if you also know that you're making X amount of money doing school visits. The fortunate position that I find myself in is that my books have been taken up by educators in very large numbers, and that was starting with Beowulf, when I realized that was selling to English teachers, and that they were just, the level of excitement that an English teacher had when they saw Beowulf was so off the charts compared to what a normal comic book fan had, right? That I just basically stopped going to comic conventions, only go to English teacher conventions. And, it's been, at this point, many of my books have been adopted, like school-wide, for grade level, whatever, whenever they read the Odyssey, whenever they read Poe, whatever it is. And that really is a big part of what's allowed me to have the career that I have. And so I'm always, you know, I encourage people to try and do something that they think has a curricular tie-in, whether it's an adaptation or whether it's a nonfiction book about a topic that, you know, that we know kids need to learn about or whatever. No guarantee that, you know, that you'll get that curriculum uptake, but if you do, it's really good because it gives the book a much longer shelf life. And if it's really widely taken up like the Odyssey has been, you know, that becomes like the mainstay of my living, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, it's actually funny. Like there could just be a Gareth Hinds curriculum in a school. Like they could, right? Your entire
yeah,
body
probably. Yeah, at this point, once the AENEID comes out, let's say they've got enough. They could probably make it through a whole school year just reading my books. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. The humanities are not dead, thank goodness.
Yeah, it's tremendously hard. Teachers are telling me all the time, like to get kids to read these original works. You know, I mean, you know, we have this crisis of literacy and of attention, you know, because of kids being on devices all the time. It makes it very, very difficult for them to get through an entire traditional print book. And, you know, in some cases, audiobooks are taking up the slack, graphic novels are taking up the slack. But like, yeah, having the graphic novel adaptation really helps, you know, the struggling readers to A, get through it, and then B, fully participate, even if they're not reading at as high level as some of the other students in the class. So yeah, that's what, you know, really motivates me to keep doing this and you know, to make that available. Initially, it was just me wanting to share my love of these classics with a new audience, and that's still a big part of it. But knowing that it's being used in that way is super motivating.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like in the 20 odd years that I've been doing this, and I think, you know, you've been in it for that, if not even longer. But I've just seen when I'm at a show, the last maybe 10 years, like there used to be like if somebody came by my table, they'd see, you know, the title Kid Beowulf, they'd chuckle. There'd be some sort of recognition of like, oh, Beowulf, I know what that is. I'm seeing that less and less of like a recognition of the name, which is just sort of curious because it means, well, it's not getting out there the way that it used to, it being the story.
Yeah.
And so that makes me have to sort of pivot to how I sell the story, so to speak, you know, and I have to change the language a little bit. And it's not a big deal, but it's just sort of anecdotally something that I think is just sort of just seen.
Yeah.
Have you come across like, you know, that, you know, not a recognition of Shakespeare or Homer or what have you, or is it in the circles that you're in, it's still pretty well recognized and embraced? And
well, I would say that I'm more aware specifically with Beowulf that there's like this notion that Beowulf is somehow iconic of like difficult ancient literature. And I don't get that, you know, I still think that's a completely mistaken view, but yeah, there's almost like a notion that people are like, oh, well, of course I haven't read Beowulf, you know, or something like that, you know, like it's
the point of pride.
Yeah, and I don't see that for Shakespeare. I don't see that for Homer. Obviously, I don't see it for Poe. Everybody still loves Poe. Although it's funny because Poe, when I was in school, Poe almost felt like you were reading a modern, you know, piece, at least to me. Whereas now I do think people have a little more trouble with the language just being, you know, like 100, you know, 150 years old. Suddenly that's archaic language. But okay, yeah. Yeah, I guess I haven't encountered as much of that. More what I encounter is just this notion that it's just hard to get them through a complete work.
Have you developed or figured out your one sentence pitch for the Aeneid?
You know, it picks up right where the Iliad leaves off. It tells the story of, you know, the Trojan hero Aeneas going to found what will become the, you know, the Roman Empire. You know, it's full of gods and monsters and battles, just like the Odyssey and the Iliad. That's still like, you know, 3 sentences. I need to get it down a little smoother, you know. So yeah,
that works. That'll get anybody to pick up the book, and on the strength of, like, as we said, your whole bookshelf of material, they know they'll be in for another great adventure. So
yeah, and I will say too, like, I wasn't just like, oh, I want to do the Aeneid and, you know, sort of complete this cycle or whatever. I actually was getting fan mail all the time from parents of kids who they would be like, oh, you know, my 6-year-old, my 8-year-old, like, has read your Odyssey and your Iliad 12 times, and they want to know when you're going to do the Aeneid. So,
Wow.
in this bizarre way that I never would have predicted, it's like the demand for that book is coming from kids who I would have said were way too young to read
Yeah,
Homer, actually asking for the Aeneid.
that's great. Well,
Yeah,
one thing I do know is those kids are, um, there's like a little savagery in them, and you deliver that for sure in both those Iliad and the Odyssey. Just
that's
in
true.
moments. Yeah.
That's true.
So
Yeah, and the parts that are over their heads, they don't care. I mean, I think people are so concerned about, um, you know, kids being exposed to, terrible things in literature. But I think, I mean, we all got scarred by something we read in high school. But aside from that, mostly I feel like, you know, young kids will read something, will be like, I didn't get that, fine,
yeah,
they don't care. Or I didn't get that, and I'm sort of still fascinated by this story, and I'll go back and read it 12 times because I want to understand what's going on. But like, they don't, like, they're pretty good at sort of almost like self-censoring what they understand,
yes.
if they feel like it's outside of their experience.
Yeah, yeah. And I think there's and I appreciate, just as somebody who loves the classics, the originals, is that um you're not sanitizing anything.
Right.
They're like I said before, they stand on the shelf with the adaptations that have already been done, and
Yeah.
the translations. So
Yeah,
um
really the only thing I do is tone down the nudity a little bit, and that's basically it.
right.
And even like with the kind of the gore, there's a couple places where like I'll have a certain panel, and my wife will be like, that's a little too gory. Can just show the same thing, but in this, just a little bit less up close or whatever, and then I'll make that adjustment. But that's all stuff that Homer described and Virgil described, and
Right.
it's in there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, it's good that you have the beta reader too,
Yeah.
and just that other outside,
Yes.
um, because
Important.
I imagine you're generally working in a vacuum, right? Like you're head down creating and
Yep.
uh, coming up for air on occasion.
Yeah, and I really only share it at a couple stages, right? Like when all the rough sketches for the book are done, that's when I share it with my editor and my scholarly readers and my wife. Up until that point, basically nobody has seen it. And then when I'm going along through the line art, if I have a specific question or a specific sequence, I'll share it with my wife, or I'll send it to one of these scholarly readers. But my editor doesn't see it again usually until all the finished art is done. Or like in this case, if it's a really big project, I'll send it to them a little early. I sent Candlewick a version that was like 200 pages were colored and the last 50 pages were still line art, so they could sort of get started and
Right.
make sure there wasn't any big issues we needed to address before I delivered the last 50 pages of color.
But it sounds like you are, um, top to bottom. You're art directing this piece and
Yeah,
delivering it, and
yeah.
um, and that must feel good to have that level of autonomy, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I worked for years in the video game industry, and there were many reasons I got out, but one of the main reasons I got out was I just didn't feel like I had enough creative control, and I was doing a lot of work that was just kind of getting tossed out at various stages, um, and even worked on some games that got canceled and stuff. So, just being able to realize some, my own vision start to finish is definitely a big part of why I do things the way I do them. And I've experimented with collaborating with people at different stages of the process. Usually feel like, okay, it wasn't a big win, maybe, contributed something or saved me a little bit of time. I'm constantly interested in that, but in general, I feel like, what I'm doing is so complicated. There's so many moving pieces that it's just like better if I just do everything.
Yeah, yeah. No, I get that, and there's also the little creative, what's the right word? Just shortcuts that only, like, if
Yeah,
you're doing the script and the pencils and the inks and that, like,
yeah,
know what that note means to you,
yeah,
and you can just deliver.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Um,
Although
uh,
again, with these multi-year projects, sometimes that gets short-circuited a little bit, and I'll be like, "Wait, what did I mean by this?" Or, "Oh, I forgot I was going to do this," and stuff like that. But because it's been like more than a year,
right,
so
right.
trying to do shorter projects.
Well, that said, I mean, have you landed on your next idea? Or is it still too early to even?
It's a little early. I mean, I have things on my list. I have lots, lots more classics I want to adapt, and I kind of have an idea of what some of the top ones are. I've got some other stuff that's like outside of the realm of classics that that I might think about doing at some point. Um, I have some original stuff that I, like to bang on in between projects, and then I usually just decide it's still not good enough or it's not finished enough or whatever, and I just need to go and give my audience another classic that they're waiting for. My faithful English teachers that
Right.
um,
That you
I
meet every year at NCTE, right?
exactly. So I
Yeah,
hear from them. They're like, "When
yeah,
are you going to do Hamlet?" Whatever. So
yeah,
that's on the list. And I'm also always trying to figure out what people are actually teaching in the classroom. So that's another good thing at NCT is I get some feedback about that, and what people are actually asking for and what they're teaching, because that's changed over time. And there's like there was a recent study and they released like the top 10, but I'm waiting for them to release like the rest of the list of what are the most taught books as of like 2 years ago, whenever they did the study. Um, Also, I really enjoyed adapting Poe, because again, like shorter, just working in shorter chunks and doing these short stories was really fun. So I know there's a lot of classic short stories that people use in the classroom that show up in textbooks and stuff like that. So one possibility is I might do another anthology that's collecting different short stories um, that are used a lot in the classroom. There's other mythologies that people have asked me to dip into. And of course, there's a lot more Greek mythology I haven't dipped into as well. So
sure.
yeah, there's all kinds of possibilities.
Yeah, yeah. The only thing I appreciate as we wrap up is the your. I mean, you mentioned we're both comic book fans, and I'm sure we've been to the
Mhm.
comic conventions and even exhibited them, and um uh, but the fact that you are smartly going to where your readership is, or
Yeah,
that you can introduce them to something that's going to resonate with them, like NCTE, which I think
yeah,
for those who aren't familiar with, it's the National Teachers Council of English. Did I get those all right?
yeah.
And they
Wrong
meet
order, but yeah, National Council of Teachers of English. Yeah,
yes, yeah, National Council of Teachers of English. They meet
yeah,
every year,
yeah,
um, and you're like I exhibited a year or two, but it's like you're an oasis of graphic novels and not many other folks are dialed into this.
yeah. I mean, I'm usually one of the only authors who has their own booth, and I've been doing it every year for many, many, many years because that's basically where I found my audience. I mean, I went to a regional English teachers conference, and then I went to the national conference one year, and I was just like, oh my God, like this is it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I go there every year, and it's a heavy lift to go there. If you're listening to this and you're a creator, like unless your books are like perfectly positioned for English teachers, like it costs a lot of money and there's a lot of logistics involved in getting to that show and exhibiting there. But yeah, for me, I always find it worthwhile. Not meaning that I make a lot of money. Some years I make money, some years I don't. But that I make these contacts, and I'll hear from these people like, oh yeah, I bought your book 5 years ago, and now I'm the head of the English department, and we're using your Beowulf in ninth grade and your Odyssey in 10th grade or whatever, stuff like that. So that's why it's worth it for me to do it. And back when I was self-publishing, I also found it worthwhile to advertise in their journals, because that was a really good way to reach that target market. Nowadays, doing ads doesn't make as much sense because it's like if I'm pushing them to my own website, then I have to fill those orders, which is a pain. And if I'm just pushing them to Candlewick, then I'm only getting whatever 10% of those sales. So I don't do that anymore, but I still love going to that show.
I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I appreciate this shop talk, this conversation. It's always fun to just uh, see what you're working on, and it's always exciting for the classics nerd in me to just pick your brain. Uh,
All right, but before we go, I just feel
oh
like
yeah,
we've been talking about me for the entire time. So I just want to ask, so
yeah,
the new book, The Odyssey,
yeah.
give me your take on like how you're integrating the Odyssey with Kid Beowulf.
Oh well, I appreciate that. It's so it's the I'm doing it a little differently than the others, that because the first four books in this series are just sort of like yours, 200 pages, one full story all the way through.
Yep.
And which we've talked about, like that can be exhausting. And this other idea of like, I'm kind of just doing the stories whenever I can find the time and piecemeal, and like and I'm always trying to figure out ways to be more efficient, sort of just like you. I think we always trying to crack that code. So I've been reading a lot of manga recently, and I've been very interested in the how that delivery system of just like the 10 to 12 page chapter chunk. And so for this version of what I'm doing with the Odyssey, I'm trying to take that tack of just doing episodically, actually just like the Odyssey, 24 books in the Odyssey. I want to do 24 chapters and then just attack it that way. And so for this version that I'm putting together, this first issue, Beowulf and Grendel are separated, and I've felt that it was probably important to give the reader kind of what they expect, in that like they'll encounter Grendel's going to encounter the sirens, Beowulf will encounter the Lastrygonians, and like so they're kind of separated. They're trying to find each other, but they're encountering all the great monsters and elements of the story along the way. And I will get to Odysseus, but that'll, I kind of feel like I need to deliver up front some of the goods. And ultimately I'm just trying to have fun with it, because it is such a fun story, and I don't want to take it to we always take our work seriously, but I want to have fun with it because it is such a fun adventure tale. And so
awesome.
So far so good. We'll see. But it does feel good to accomplish a little bit of a story, and then like recharge and get ready for the next chapter. So there's
here short sections of stories. Yay.
For your new beautiful edition of the Odyssey, what's the best way for folks to get this hardcover version?
Well, so they can get it if you want your book signed, you can go directly to my website, which is garethhinds.com. Also on garethhinds.com, though, you will find a list of events that I'm doing. So if one of those is near you, you could get a book directly from me at the event, or you can order from that store and they will have signed copies. And that in some ways is better for me, because I don't have to ship you a book, and then they'll buy more books to reorder and keep in stock. So
and you have a big slate of events to promote it.
Definitely half dozen events. Most of them are just local around DC, but I'm also coming to LA for a couple of events at the end of the month, and I'm also trying to line up a couple more events around when the film comes out, because that seems like a good idea. So you doing anything around the film?
Just the usual. As I said, this is all sort of linked around the Kickstarter that I'm going to be doing, and doing the promotional for that. And I will certainly see the film as well, and I look forward to hearing what your take is. I'm hopeful. I always love adaptations, like we've been talking about, and it's fun to just sort of see how somebody else interprets something. So,
and Nolan's a smart director, so I have more faith than I would with a lot of people.
That's for sure. And I'm hopeful that Matt Damon is a good pick. He's so anyway, fingers crossed all the way down. So anyway, this was super fun. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to the AENEID and everything else that you end up doing. So
awesome. All right.
Thanks, man.
Thanks. Good to talk to you. Take care.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Shop Talk, brought to you by Kid Beowulf Odyssey. Funding now at kidbcomickickstarter.com.